Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We appreciate the opportunity to address the assembled body tonight. As one of the few combat veterans in the U.S. Congress, I rise to express deep concerns about what we are doing in Libya at this moment. Mr. Speaker, we have committed the U.S. taxpayers and we've committed U.S. troops to engagements that have extended almost a decade, having been involved in one of those long overseas engagements before in Vietnam. I know that the strain that these actions place on our families and on our young soldiers, and I don't think that the administration has adequately thought out what we are doing and what we're asking the taxpayers of this country to do and the young people of this country to do, engaging in yet a third front with questionable ideas and questionable values at the heart of why we're engaging in the discussion. I've been an ardent supporter of the war on terror. I believe that we're going to be committed to the war regardless if it is there in their backyard or in our backyard. But I rise tonight to say that I'm adamantly opposed to extending our forces any further than what we've already extended them without asking our allies to provide their tax money and to put the lives of their young people on the line. The entire world is benefiting from the sacrifices that this country is making to establish order and to establish some modicum of peace in regions that are not given naturally to such. And since the world benefits, then the world has a responsibility. So I think the President should be calling on our allies to fund the NATO mission and to provide the people, the personnel, and the weapons. And yet, as I look at a breakdown of the missions that have been flown and fought so far, I find a dominance of U.S. cost in lives, in hours, monetary resources, and in morale. As a veteran, I find it disturbing that we're in two wars and now intervening in a third with no end in sight. Our mission is unclear. Having served in Vietnam at a time when our nation was beginning to withdraw support for that war, and remembering being there in those countries when funding was made short and gasoline and fuel was taken from stateside missions in order to fly combat missions, I remember with dismay a nation that was not fully supporting the combat troops. I find these actions to be questionable on behalf of our Commander-in-Chief as it regards Libya. Despite his speech last night, President Obama simply raised more questions. He explained that America is different. I'm not certain of exactly how that rationale applies to putting young men and women in harm's way, but I don't think it is a deep enough explanation. What is the time frame? The President has yet to clarify. Are we there to enforce a no-fly zone? Then let our friends and neighbors in the United Nations enforce the no-fly zone. If we're there to enforce a no-fly zone, why then are we bombing ground troops? They don't affect the no-fly zone. If the goal was to protect civilians, why did Secretary Clinton meet with a rebel leader in London? Why is Secretary Clinton calling for Mr. Gaddafi to step down if we're only enforcing the no-fly zone and protecting civilians? This war is going to go back and forth, and already you see our leaders wondering if we can be out by the end of the year, and I wonder if we can be out by the end of the decade. Now, make no mistake about it. If Libya had done something to harm us, to put our troops in danger, I would be 100% supportive, but I question extending us and our troops to one more war zone. Why are we fighting a war that Secretary of Defense Robert Gates said bears no strategic interest to the U.S. and does not jeopardize our national security? Why are we working on the side of the rebels? Their own commander has stated that al-Qaeda members who fought our troops in Iraq are now fighting Mr. Gaddafi. In Libya, we're working with the same people we're trying to kill in Afghanistan. Not only that, but it looks like we're arming those same troops. And I worry that our armaments supplied to troops in Libya will show up in the fight against Americans in Afghanistan and Iraq. As a combat veteran, I find these concerns to be deeply disappointing in an administration who for nearly 2 weeks could not point to whether NATO, the U.S., France, or the United Kingdom was in charge. This is poor management, a management I saw during the Vietnam War, with little sense of purpose and always a confusion about exactly why we were there and how long we would stay. Humanitarian missions are admirable. However, sending troops in to combat with no apparent overarching mission is dangerous. Everyone in this room remembers Somalia in 1993. Why are we singling out Libya? There's a war going on in the Ivory Coast right now. Saudi troops have cracked down on protesters in Bahrain in recent weeks, with civilian deaths reported. Not a whisper of American intervention there. According to the Genocide Intervention Network, since 2009, almost 1 million people have been displaced in ongoing fighting in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. 5.6 million civilians are estimated killed since 1996. Are we going to intervene there? Saddam Hussein killed hundreds of thousands of his own people using mustard gas and other weapons. The President was totally opposed as a senator to that war, despite the fact that it had congressional authorization, and yet here he is leading us into this new conflict. The President needs to consider the fact that the mission is unclear, despite his speech last night. He needs to realize that America cannot intervene in wars where we face no threat to our national security and have no strategic interest. He should listen to his Secretary of Defense. As we engage in this yet third conflict, we're going to continue to put budget pressure on a budget that is straining beyond belief. In this country, the greatest threat that we face right now is a mounting national debt that is almost $15 trillion, almost the equivalent to our entire gross domestic product. At the time when we're expending more resources and more dollars in a conflict that has to be yet determined as to its scope, purpose, and length, we're straining our budget even further. And while we're conducting these outside forces to greater costs to our U.S. government, we're conducting a war on the West in this country and choking the West of jobs right now. So at a time when the cost to our government is increasing, we're choking down the tax resources by simply regulating and taxing jobs out of existence. In the past 10 days, most of us were at home at work in our districts. I, like everyone else, made a lot of miles in the last 10 days. We drove almost 1,300 miles and did 20 and 30 and 40 events, meeting with people and listening to their concerns, and everywhere we heard the same concern. What are you doing about jobs? And my sad report had to be that this government, instead of creating jobs, is in fact choking off jobs. This government is in fact making it impossible for employers to bring on new laborers, to expand the workforce and create that sense of prosperity that this nation has always had available to it. And people would ask why. And they would also ask how. How is our government choking off jobs? They find it incredulous. They don't want to believe me when I say that in our speeches to begin with. How is our government choking off jobs? So I use as an example the Forest Service. This nation used to have a vibrant logging industry, a timber industry that employed hundreds of thousands. Just in New Mexico, a very small state, over 20,000 people made their living in the timber industry in New Mexico. Today, no one makes their living in the timber industry in New Mexico. Over 20 mills have been idled. The woodcutters and the choppers no longer have work. Our mountain communities that used to depend on logging now depend on tourism, which is a very distant second as it provides incomes for our families to live and pay their bills on. Our government put an entire industry out of work in the 1970s with a program, with a regulation based around the spotted owl. The theory was that if we wanted to protect the owl, we had to limit all the activity in the forest. And so we simply killed the forest, the timber cutting jobs in our national forest across this country. And nowhere did it hit harder than in New Mexico. Our government said you can no longer go into the forest and cut trees because we're going to reserve the entire amount of land for the spotted owl. And an industry was killed overnight. Right now in New Mexico, the oil and gas industry hires about the same number of people that the timber industry used to hire. About 23,000 people now work for oil and gas. We provide energy for much of the world, much of the country. And yet those jobs now are at risk because the Fish and Wildlife Service just recently announced that they're going to list a lizard as an endangered species. Now keep in mind that this lizard is seen everywhere. But when people ask me, what's so significant about this lizard? I tell them, well, you just can't count the lizards out there. You have to stop them. You have to raise them up, raise their arm, and count the number of scales between the elbow and the shoulder underneath their arm. And the endangered lizard has one less scale, or one more scale, I'm not sure which, than the other lizards. And people are saying, wait, your government would kill our jobs over one scale under a lizard's arm, his front leg? And they're simply aghast that with 9.5% unemployment, that our government would be undertaking such punitive ways of interpreting the Endangered Species Act. Now, my belief is that we can keep the spotted owl alive in our forests and cut timber, and my belief is that it'll make healthier forests. And so we have introduced a bill which simply says, yes, we want to keep the spotted owl alive in sanctuaries. We'll make 1,000 acres here, 1,000 acres over there, but in the million acres in between, we're going to allow logging for the first time in a couple of decades. For the first time, the mountain communities that used to thrive on timber cutting have the opportunity for jobs. But even more than that, as we cut trees, New Mexico is a very arid climate. What used to happen is that fires would burn the trees down to where there were only about 50 per acre. So we were broad savanna lands with our national forest scattered trees. You can visualize how many 50 per acre is. That would be widely spaced with grass in between. And when the rains would come, the water would soak in and recharge the aquifers, but also recharge the aquifers around our stream. Since we have stopped cutting trees in our national forest, they now are crowded from 50 trees per acre to 2,500 trees per acre. And now then the streams are running dry because the trees use up so much more water than the grasslands that were native to the region.